The sun was sinking below the horizon when Kevin drove up to his aunt's house. The small suburban area looked as quiet and peaceful as ever. It was one of those places where people knew each other, where in the evening you can only hear the noise of the TV through the slightly open windows and the noise of cars rarely passing along the street. Kevin parked on the side of the road and got out of the car. He looked at the house. The light in the windows was warm, and it made him feel even more comfortable. Aunt Diana always knew how to create an atmosphere at home that made you forget about all the problems. Her house seemed like an island of peace in this troubled world. But today he had a strange feeling that something was going to change, although he couldn't figure out what exactly. He adjusted his backpack on his shoulder and headed for the gate. It gave way under his hand with a familiar creak, as if reminding him of all those summers he spent here as a teenager. But now he was not the young guy who was always running around the yard. In recent years, Kevin has grown up, matured, and with each visit here, he felt that Diana was changing in his eyes. She was no longer just a kind aunt who was always ready to bake pies and tell some family story. Now that her husband was on a business trip, Kevin realized that he was going to her, knowing that it would be just the two of them. And it bothered him a lot more than he wanted to admit. He raised his hand and knocked on the door. For some reason, my heart started beating faster. The sound of footsteps outside the door was distinct, confident. Her footsteps. She knew it was him, and she was expecting him. When the door opened, Diana greeted him with a warm, wide smile that warmed him as always. But something in her gaze was different. He couldn't immediately figure out what it was.
Kevin, what a meeting. How have you grown up?
Her voice was filled with joy and surprise. She stepped up to him and hugged him tightly, pressing herself against his chest. The scent of her perfume was light, fresh, with notes of something sweet. Kevin hugged her back, maybe a little harder than was appropriate, but it only lasted a second before he released her.
Hi, Aunt Diana. You've changed too, you know.
He took a step back and looked at her. Her hair was neatly tied in a ponytail. A light dress emphasized her figure. She looked different than in his memories. It was hard to describe, but she seemed more attractive to him than when he was younger.
Oh, come on. Do you probably see me quite old now?
No, you're still the same. Only better.
Her eyes widened slightly at his words, but she immediately regained her composure and smiled again. This moment was so brief that it could have gone unnoticed, but Kevin caught it. Perhaps he's not the only one who notices the changes.
Well, come in already. Don't stand on the threshold.
She stepped back to let him enter the house. Kevin walked inside and was immediately enveloped in the familiar smell of homemade cakes. The house had a warm, homely atmosphere, soft light, the smell of fresh coffee and apple pie, which, as it turned out, she had prepared especially for his arrival. Everything was exactly the same as he remembered from childhood, but with a slight hint of something new, barely perceptible. Maybe it was just the effect of time.
Well, how do you like being an adult? It's not what you expected at all, is it?
She walked over to the table, where there were already cups of coffee and a jug of juice.
Yes, let's just say that adulthood did not meet expectations. There is a lot of work, but less and less pleasure.
He sat down at the table, watching her pour him juice. Her movements were smooth, confident. She always seemed calm and balanced, but now he noticed some new details in her. The way she tosses her hair behind her back, the way she smiles at the corners of her lips when she listens to him. She put a glass in front of him and sat down opposite him.
Well, welcome to real life. But don't worry, this is just the beginning. Time will show that everything is still ahead.
They sat in silence for a few moments, enjoying the comfort that surrounded them. But there was something about the silence that kept them from relaxing completely. Kevin felt something slowly begin to spread inside him, some vague anxiety or expectation.
Do you often stay alone when Uncle Martin is away?
Her gaze became more serious for a moment, but she immediately hid it under her usual smile.
Well, business trips have become part of his job. I'm used to it already. Of course, sometimes it's boring to be alone, but I've learned how to fill in the time.
She got up and went to the window, as if she wanted to look at something outside. In fact, it was more like an attempt to hide an instant vulnerability.
Isn't it hard for you? You know when there's no one at home.
He was looking at her back, her slim silhouette in the light of the street lamp. He couldn't help but notice how his words sounded a little more intimate than he had planned. It was as if there was a part of another meaning in this question that both of them were not ready to admit. She turned to him, a slight challenge in her eyes.
Why are you asking, Kev? You don't think I'm sitting here alone and suffering, do you?
She returned to the table and sat down opposite him again. There was a sparkle in her eyes that Kevin didn't remember seeing in her before. Was it a game or something more?
No, of course not. I just asked. Sometimes people get used to loneliness, and sometimes it drives them crazy.
And how are you? You spend a lot of time alone too, right? College probably doesn't always have enough company.
The question caught him off guard. She didn't look away but stared straight into his eyes, as if trying to read something more. Kevin swallowed and turned away for a moment, realizing that the conversation was going somewhere wrong.
Well, I'm doing fine. It's temporary, you know. Everyone has their own business, their own worries, adult life and all that.
He tried to hide his awkwardness with carelessness, but Diana caught it.
Yes, adult life is such a thing. Sometimes she gives you what you didn't expect, and sometimes she takes away what you thought was yours forever.
These words sounded mysterious, and he couldn't help but notice how they hung in the air between them. It was more than just a conversation about life and growing up. Something in their communication began to change, and Kevin felt it with every cell of his body. He wanted to say something else, but at that moment his phone rang, distracting him from his thoughts. He looked at the screen. It was one of his friends from college. But right now, he didn't want to talk to anyone. Kevin disconnected the call and put the phone on the table, trying to focus on the conversation with his aunt.
Won't you answer?
No, nothing important. I'm with you now.
Diana smiled, but there was still that strange shade in her gaze that he couldn't decipher. There was something about their communication that had changed since he arrived. This tension was growing by the minute, and Kevin realized that perhaps their relationship would never be the same. Time passed. It had been a couple of days since Kevin had arrived at his aunt's, and each of those days had become a test for his self-control. They spent a lot of time together. Diana cooked breakfast in the morning. They ate in the kitchen, discussed the latest news, and laughed as before. During the day, she showed him the city she hadn't been to in a long time, and in the evenings they watched movies or sat over a glass of wine, discussing everything in the world. Everything seemed so normal, so familiar, but inside Kevin everything was different. His gaze involuntarily lingered on her hands when she waved them in conversation, or on her neck when she straightened her hair. He was haunted by her light touches when she touched his shoulder as she passed by, or when their hands accidentally touched while passing a cup of tea to each other. These little things had never mattered to him before, but now they took on a new, exciting meaning. One evening they were sitting in the living room. The lights were dimmed, leaving most corners of the room in semi-darkness. Diana put 2 glasses and a bottle of red wine on the table, already half empty. Kevin knew he shouldn't drink too much, but the wine relaxed him, helped him get rid of these strange, contradictory thoughts. Both of them were already a little drunk, and frank notes began to appear in their conversation, which had not been there before.
You don't come to visit often, Kev. Why is that?
She was sitting on the couch, her legs slightly raised and facing him. There was something playful in her eyes, but at the same time serious. Kevin sensed that this question was not just a polite interest. She really wanted to understand why he rarely visited her.
Well, studies, work. And to be honest, I thought that you and your uncle were not up to me. You have your own life.
He raised his glass, taking a sip, and looked away. It was hard for him to look her straight in the eye at that moment.
Your own life.
Her voice was a little lower than usual, and there was a hint of irony in it.
Don't you think you're making too much of it? Martin and I are always happy to see you.
Kevin felt that slight electric shock between them again. He knew that the conversation wasn't just about his rare visits. It was about something deeper than their usual family relationship.
Maybe. But you have your own family, your own affairs, and I am no longer the child you once knew.
He tried to keep his voice neutral, but couldn't avoid a slight shiver that ran down his spine. He knew that every time they talked about such a topic, he felt the ground under his feet begin to leave. Diana looked at him. Her gaze softened. She put the glass down on the table and, slightly tilting her head, studied his face.
You've changed, it's true. I'm looking at you now and I see a grown man. You understand that, don't you?
Her words hit him like a hammer. Everything he'd been trying to suppress since he'd entered her house had suddenly become apparent. She saw it. And more than that, she wanted him to understand it.
Yes, I understand. I notice it too.
He put the glass down on the table, feeling that the conversation was going somewhere where it would be difficult for both of them to stay the same. This was the moment when the masks should have fallen off, when they both finally realized what was between them. They sat in silence for a few seconds, which seemed like an eternity. Each of them was trying to figure out what was next. It was the very moment when they both realized that something was changing in their relationship, something they couldn't ignore anymore.
You know, I've been thinking about you more than usual lately.
These words hung in the air between them, like a bell warning that something was about to happen. Kevin couldn't bring himself to answer right away. He felt his stomach tighten, his breathing quicken.
What are you talking about?
He knew what she was talking about, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it. He wanted her to say it first, because then he wouldn't have to take on this responsibility. Diana smiled a little, but it was a sad smile. She looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether to say what was on her mind.
I see the way you look at me, Kev, and I can't ignore it. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but now...
She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. Kevin immediately understood what she meant. His heart was pounding like crazy, and the blood rushed to his face. He didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do. They both found themselves on the brink, where every word could change their relationship forever.
Diana, this is wrong. We can't.
He didn't finish because he wasn't sure what he was going to say. It was so easy to say, this is wrong, but it's so hard to follow it, because he knew it was wrong. But he wanted to keep going anyway. He wanted her. Diana took a step closer, and their eyes met. She no longer tried to hide behind friendly smiles or family jokes. She was as honest as ever.
I know, but you know what? Sometimes right and wrong are just words. You can feel it, can't you?
Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but that made her every word cut like a knife. Kevin felt his hands start to shake. He wanted to tell her that they had to stop, that they couldn't keep doing this. But instead, he heard his own voice, which betrayed him.
Yes, I feel it.
The words came out of his mouth so easily that he was scared himself. He looked at her and saw that she was waiting for this confession, but at the same time she was afraid of it. She came closer, and now there was not even a meter of distance between them. Kevin could feel her breathing, could see her chest trembling with excitement. They stood face to face, almost touching each other. This moment could last forever, and at the same time it could end at any second. They both knew this shouldn't be happening. But now, at this moment, they were ready to ignore all the prohibitions.
We don't have to do anything. It's just... You don't have to pretend that it doesn't exist. Okay.
Her words sounded like a sentence, like a bridge between what they felt and what could happen. Kevin looked into her eyes and saw something more than just love or affection shining in them. It was a passion they both feared. He wanted to retreat, wanted to just walk away, but his legs wouldn't obey. He took a step forward, and now there was not an inch left between them. Her warmth enveloped him, her breath touched his skin.
Diana, we can't.
But instead of answering, she put her hand on his chest, and the touch overshadowed all his thoughts. He knew it was a mistake. He knew that everything was not going where it should have been. But his body, his mind, his heart, everything was against him.
Quiet. Just be here.
Her hand was light, but the full force of their suppressed desires was felt in this touch. Kevin felt his head spin, and his heart beat even faster. He leaned a little closer, feeling her scent, her warmth. And at that moment, time seemed to stop. They stood as if they were waiting for something to happen, but at the same time they were afraid of it. There was a line between them that they both understood, but that no one wanted to cross first. The night overtook them unexpectedly. During the day, they both seemed to be trying to stay as far away from each other as possible, busy with various little things. Kevin was reading a book, trying to concentrate, and Diana was busy cleaning the kitchen. They both knew that this day was just a prelude to the evening that was already on the way. What was going to happen had been in the air since morning, like an invisible ritual that they were drawn to. When the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, the house began to look even more secluded. Silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional sound of a car driving down the street, covered them. Kevin was in the living room, his eyes were glued to the TV screen, but the movie he chose for evening viewing had long since lost its meaning for him. He didn't even remember how this movie started. His mind had been wandering elsewhere for a long time. He thought about what had happened yesterday, about how their conversation had changed, how there was a tension in it that could not be escaped. Diana was sitting on the couch next to her, her legs were tucked under her, and she seemed relaxed. However, Kevin knew that her calmness was just an appearance. He could feel her hand, which had accidentally touched his during the same movie, lingering a little longer than necessary. He felt her gaze turn to him from time to time, but she quickly turned away when he turned his head. It was like a game in which both knew the rules, but no one wanted to be the first to make the next move. The wine they were drinking was gradually starting to take its toll. It drew them to something more outspoken, bold, but the words still remained unspoken. Both were lost in their own thoughts, and it seemed like a battle of wits was unfolding between them, in which each was trying to figure out how far they could go. Kevin felt like something was bursting at the seams inside him. The whole day was filled with a strange tension that he couldn't ignore. This was not an ordinary family meeting. There was something more here, something that went beyond the usual communication between aunt and nephew. He couldn't get the moment when they were so close to each other out of his mind. This feeling did not leave him, no matter how hard he tried to distract himself. He knew that he had to hold on, that all he had to do was relax a little, and everything would go the other way. Diana, in turn, was lost in her own thoughts. She also felt this strange tension. It wasn't easy for her. During these days, she realized that Kevin is no longer the boy she once knew. He had changed, and it bothered her. She noticed his looks, his awkwardness, but at the same time she saw something in him that attracted her. It was wrong, and she knew it. But every time she thought about stopping it all, her body and mind resisted it. These thoughts tormented her all day. She noticed how her own desires began to surface. She tried to suppress them, convincing herself that they were just fantasies, that it was all nothing more than the result of long loneliness and a familiar connection with Kevin. But these fantasies became more and more real. She noticed how she began to pay attention to his movements, his gaze, his gestures. It bothered her because she understood that if she didn't stop, the consequences could be devastating. But at the same time, it was hard for her to resist this feeling. The night grew deeper and deeper, and the tension between them only increased with each passing hour. Kevin could no longer focus on the movie, the books, or anything else. It was hard for him to be around Diana, but he didn't want to leave. His mind was full of contradictions. He knew it was wrong, but every time his thoughts went that way, something flared up inside him, making him forget about all these rules. At some point, Diana got up from the couch and headed to the kitchen, leaving him alone in silence. She was standing at the kitchen table, her gaze fixed on a bottle of wine that was on the table. She knew it was time to end the evening, that they both needed to go to separate rooms and try to sleep, but instead, her hand reached for the bottle. She slowly poured herself another glass and took a long sip. The wine warmed her from the inside out, but it wasn't just the warmth of alcohol, it was something more that pulsed somewhere deep in her chest. She returned to the living room and sat down next to Kevin again. Now they were only a few centimeters apart. He sensed her presence as soon as she approached. Her scent, her closeness, it was all driving him crazy. It seemed to him that he couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't focus on his thoughts. Everything seemed blurry and wrong. But despite that, he didn't want to leave. Diana sat in silence. Her thoughts were as restless as Kevin's. She looked at him from under half-closed eyelids, trying to figure out what was going on in his head. Her hand involuntarily twitched in his direction, but she stopped herself. She knew she couldn't do that. It was a moment when everything could have changed, but she wasn't ready to take that step. Kevin felt her tension as strongly as he felt his own. He saw her hand move towards him, but she stopped. It was a moment they would both remember. They were on the edge where every move, every look could destroy everything. He felt that if he did something now, everything would go a different way. The clock on the wall struck midnight, and the sound seemed to cut through the air between them. It was a reminder that the night was already too deep, and that they should have gone to their rooms long ago. But none of them moved. They continued to sit on the couch, staring at the TV screen, which had long since ceased to interest them. Their whole world is now focused on what is happening here and now. Kevin felt something breaking inside him. He knew he couldn't hold on any longer. He knew that if he stayed here another minute, he would do something he would regret later. His mind was telling him to get up, leave, go to his room, close up, and try to forget this evening. But his body resisted. He couldn't get up. His feet seemed to be chained to the floor. Diana couldn't take the strain anymore either. She felt that if she didn't break this chain of events now, everything would get out of control. She understood that their relationship would no longer be the same, that this moment would be the point of no return. But something inside her drew her to him. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't stop. Her body resisted her mind. At some point, Kevin felt his hand involuntarily move in her direction. He didn't want to do it, but his body no longer obeyed his thoughts. Her warmth attracted him like a magnet. He knew it was wrong, that they both needed to stop, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. The silence around them was becoming unbearable. It was like waiting before a storm the very moment when everything froze, and you know that something is about to happen. Kevin could feel his heart pounding in his chest as his every breath became heavier. He knew he couldn't take the strain anymore. Diana felt it too. She knew that this evening would change them forever. But instead of breaking the chain, she chose to stay. She knew it would be her mistake, but this mistake seemed so sweet, so desirable. They both sat side by side, lost in their own thoughts, each of them trying to figure out how far they were willing to go. There were no words between them, but their every look, every movement said that words were no longer needed. They both had to make a choice that would change everything. The night was quiet, too quiet. There was not a single sound outside, as if the whole world had stopped, leaving Diana and Kevin alone with their thoughts and feelings. The house that had seemed like a safe haven to them was now taking on a different look. The walls that once gave them a feeling of warmth and comfort were now shrinking around them, as if they wanted to keep them in this state of uncertainty and forbidden attraction. Kevin was lying in bed, but sleep was far from him. Every cell in his body was tense, as if he was waiting for something he couldn't put into words. His mind wandered around one thing, Diana. He tried to focus on other things, on trying to fall asleep, but it seemed useless. His whole being was consumed by thoughts of her, of how her presence had taken over his mind. He couldn't get her out of his mind, her gaze, her movements, her touch. Even the most casual touch of her hand was like an electric shock to him, which awakened something long hidden in him. He tried to convince himself that it was wrong, that they couldn't afford to cross that line. But with each passing hour, with each passing moment, his mind was giving up. These thoughts, which until recently seemed forbidden to him, became more and more tempting. He saw her face in front of him, her delicate features, her eyes that looked at him with that sparkle that he could not forget. There was something in her gaze that made him feel different from before. It was the look of a woman, not a relative, and it drove him crazy. The room was stuffy, and this only increased his anxiety. He tried to calm down, but every time he closed his eyes, a picture rose in front of him, Diana, sitting next to him on the couch, their hands barely touching each other, her breath so close that he could feel it on his skin. The whole evening, every moment spent with her, was etched in his memory so vividly that he couldn't get it out of his head. He lay staring at the ceiling, listening to his rapid breathing, and realized that this could not go on. Diana wasn't sleeping either. She was sitting in her bedroom with her arms wrapped around a pillow, and her thoughts were no less restless. At that moment, she felt completely vulnerable, as if she was trapped in her own feelings and desires. Everything she had tried to hide behind a mask of calm and composure was now coming to the surface. Her hands were shaking, she couldn't sit still. Thoughts of Kevin swirled in her head like a whirlpool from which there was no way out. She saw the way he looked at her, saw his gaze, which was not the gaze of his nephew. He looked at her as a woman, and it scared her. But what scared her even more was that she also began to look at him in a different way. These feelings, which she considered unacceptable, awoke in her with unexpected force. She tried to fight it, telling herself that it was just a fleeting attraction that would pass if she could just pull away. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw him. She could feel him near her, even when he wasn't physically there. His presence permeated her entire being, like a poisonous but sweet smell that she couldn't get rid of. She replayed the moment when they were sitting next to each other, over and over in her head. She remembered how their hands had almost touched, how her heart had started beating faster then. It wasn't just excitement, it was something more, something she couldn't control. She felt like she was on the brink of a precipice, where every step could lead to disaster. But this risk, this danger, seemed unbearably attractive to her. Time passed slowly, as if trying to give them both time to realize what was happening to them. But the more they thought, the stronger the attraction became. Diana could no longer hide from her feelings. She knew it would take time for these thoughts and feelings to cool down, but every minute with Kevin only intensified them. Her mind told her one thing, but her body told her another. She got out of bed and went to the window, hoping that the fresh air would help her cope with this agonizing anxiety. But looking at the street lit by the dim light of the lanterns, she realized that she could not escape from what was happening inside her. Even if she went outside, even if she left this house, thoughts of Kevin would stay with her. They were deeper than simple attraction. It was something that penetrated into her mind, into her blood, into every cell of her body. She went back to bed, but sleep still wouldn't come. Her head was heavy with thoughts, her body tense like a string. She couldn't find a place for herself. At some point she wanted to just get up, go to Kevin's room and tell him everything, to tell him how she feels, to share this heavy burden with him. But every time she was about to do it, her mind brought her back to reality. She knew she couldn't afford it. That would be a mistake, and the consequences could be devastating. But the more she thought about what should be right, the more she realized that her heart was telling her something completely different. These feelings were not something that could be simply suppressed. They were getting stronger every day, every minute. She couldn't ignore them anymore. She knew that if they both didn't find a way to stop, they would inevitably cross the line beyond which there would be no return. Meanwhile, Kevin could no longer stay in bed. He got up and went to the window, looking out at the empty street. The silence around him only increased his inner discomfort. He felt like he had to do something, but he didn't know what it was. He stood peering into the darkness, trying to find answers to the questions that had plagued him for the past few days. It seemed to him that his relationship with Diana had reached an impasse, and the only way out was to admit what was going on between them. But a confession would mean the end of everything they knew. This would mean that they would either have to accept these feelings and destroy everything they had built, or try to forget them, but live with this knowledge for the rest of their lives. Both options seemed unbearable to him. He couldn't imagine that they would be able to return to their previous relationship as if nothing had happened. Everything had changed, and he knew it. Diana knew too. This internal struggle continued in both. Everyone was trying to find an answer that would allow them to maintain their balance, but that balance no longer existed. They were both caught up in a wave of feelings that they couldn't control. It was like a storm that covered them and left no way out. The night went on endlessly. They were both rushing around their rooms, each in their own world, but with the same thoughts. It was like a game on the edge in which no one wanted to take the first step, but it was also impossible to retreat. They both knew that something important was about to happen. It might be their mistake, but this mistake was inevitable. The feelings they were trying to suppress turned out to be stronger than them. It was a forbidden attraction that haunted them. It was more than just a passing wish. It was like a fire that was igniting. It's lazy, but it's getting brighter by the second. And this fire, if not extinguished, was ready to consume them both. They both knew that there would be no turning back in the next step of their lives. But this step seemed inevitable, as well as the fact that they both understood they would no longer be able to hide these feelings. The forbidden attraction captured them completely. The world around them seemed to freeze. The night was unbearably quiet, and in that silence Diana and Kevin were on the edge of a precipice from which they knew it would be impossible to get out. Their every look, every movement was filled with the tension that they had been trying to suppress all these days. But it became impossible to contain it further. The evening turned out to be eventful. They tried to behave as usual. They had dinner, watched a movie, but both Diana and Kevin knew that all this was just a cover. Their thoughts were not focused on ordinary everyday affairs, but on something much more forbidden and frightening. Every moment they spent together only increased their desire to be closer, to break down the wall they had been building for so long. When the movie ended, Diana turned off the TV, and silence reigned in the room. It was not an ordinary silence, but one that envelops the space before the storm. Kevin was sitting on the couch, and his gaze was directed away, avoiding meeting her eyes. But he felt her presence, as if she were closer than she really was. Every breath seemed loud to him, every movement of her body almost tangible. Diana sat down on the edge of the sofa. Her hands were shaking, but she tried to hide it. A storm was raging inside her. Everything she was trying to suppress burst out with incredible force. Her thoughts were chaotic, intertwined between morality and desire. Her mind kept saying one thing: this is wrong. This needs to be stopped, but her body, her heart, disagreed with her. She felt herself drawn to Kevin with a kind of frightening force. It was more than just a physical attraction. It was something that had awakened inside her and no longer wanted to remain hidden. She couldn't fight it anymore, even though she tried. Every look at him, every moment with him, made her heart beat faster. And now, in that silence, she realized that the moment of truth had come. Kevin was sitting next to her, and his heart was pounding so hard that he was afraid she would hear. Everything that has been happening these days has come to a climax. He knew that he was on the edge, on the very edge, where he could still take a step back and put everything back in its place. But at the same time, he felt that to take a step back was to betray himself, to betray what he felt. All that held him back was the thought that he and Diana were connected by family ties, that their relationship should never have crossed that line. But this boundary was so fragile that now she could no longer hold them. Diana slowly got up and went to the window, as if trying to find the answer to her questions there. Her steps were slow but confident. She stopped and looked out at the street, illuminated by the dim light of the lanterns. The silence of the night seemed unnatural, as if the whole world was waiting for them to make their choice. Something clicked inside her, as if all the internal barriers had collapsed in an instant. She felt that she could no longer hold on to the old principles, to the rules that she had set for herself. Everything she knew was destroyed. Kevin was no longer the boy she had once known. He had become a man, and now it drew her to him with such force that she could no longer resist. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts, but her mind was too overwhelmed with emotions. She knew there was no point in resisting anymore. Kevin also realized that this moment had come. His whole body was tense, and every nerve in his body was stretched like a string. He felt her, felt this strange connection between them, which was getting stronger. All that held him back was the remnants of his mind, which told him that they couldn't do it. But these remnants of reason became quieter and quieter under the onslaught of emotions that took over his head. He slowly got up from the couch and walked over to her. His footsteps were quiet, as if he was afraid to break the fragile silence that surrounded them. But at the same time, a storm was raging inside him. He knew that this moment would change everything. All he had to do was hold out his hand, and their relationship would never be the same again. Diana felt his approach, although she did not turn her head. She knew it was inevitable. Their attraction has become too strong to ignore. She had tried to resist it, but now it seemed impossible. She could feel his breath, his warmth. It was so close, so real, that her heart stopped for a moment. Kevin stopped for a moment, standing behind her. He wanted to stop, to give himself another opportunity to rethink everything. But at the same time, he knew it was too late. This moment was inevitable. He reached out and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. This touch was like a spark that ran through their bodies, connecting them in one inexpressible sensation. Diana didn't turn away. She stood there, feeling his touch, and her heart was beating so fast that she thought she would pass out. At that moment, she realized that she could no longer fight what was happening. She turned her head and looked at him. Their eyes met, and in that look there was everything: fear, desire, doubt, passion. Everything was mixed up together, and neither of them could look away. They stood like that for a few seconds, which seemed like an eternity. It was that moment when everything was on edge, when the world around them seemed to disappear. Kevin felt his hand slowly slide down her back, and that touch was like a fire that filled his whole being. He couldn't control himself anymore. It was more than he could bear. Diana could feel his touch driving her crazy. She knew she couldn't stop anymore. All these days she had been trying to escape from these feelings, but now they had captured her completely. She turned slowly towards him, her eyes full of passion and determination. She took a step forward, and at that moment their bodies touched. This moment was like an explosion. All the pent-up emotions, all the suppressed desires burst out. It was more than just physical intimacy. It was something deeper, something that connected them on a level they were both afraid to admit. Their hands met, and at that moment, everything around them ceased to exist. The whole world has narrowed down to the two of them. Kevin could feel her touch making him lose control. He could no longer think about what was right and what was wrong. All that mattered was them. Diana felt it too. Her body responded to his every touch, her mind clouded. Everything they had been holding back was now bursting out with incredible force. They couldn't pretend anymore. It was their decision, their step into the unknown. Everything that had happened before seemed far away and unimportant. Now there was only this moment, their passion, their desire. They took the first step that will change their lives forever. This step was full of fear and at the same time a huge release. This was the moment when all the internal prohibitions collapsed, when all the restrictions that they had set for themselves no longer mattered. It was like falling into an abyss, but this fall was sweet, it was welcome. They allowed themselves this moment, and in that moment there was everything fear, pain, passion, love. This was the release they were both looking for without even realizing it. There was no turning back now. This step changed them forever, but at the same time it was something they had both been waiting for all their lives. The morning came unexpectedly. The dark veil of night slowly receded, giving way to the first light of dawn, but instead of a feeling of renewal and hope, the morning brought with it only anxiety. The room was quiet, but that silence was no longer cozy and soothing. It became oppressive, as if the space around them was shrinking under the pressure of their own thoughts. Everything that had happened between them during the night now weighed on them like a heavy burden from which it was impossible to escape. Kevin was lying on the bed. His body was motionless, but his mind was in chaos. He stared at the ceiling, unable to focus on anything. His mind was racing, trying to find at least some logical thread that could explain how they got to this point. The night he spent with Diana was not just the result of their passion, it was something more, something that he could not fully comprehend. He felt lost, as if the whole world around him had collapsed, leaving him among the rubble. He could no longer see in Diana the same woman he had known since childhood. She was something more, a woman with whom he had experienced something forbidden, but that made it even more attractive. But now, as the light of day began to penetrate the room, reality pressed down on him with all its force. He realized that he had made a huge mistake that could not be corrected. His whole world, all his beliefs, were destroyed. He couldn't understand how they had allowed this to happen. He knew it was wrong, but the moment their bodies merged, everything that was right lost all meaning. Now that the passion has receded, it has been replaced by the painful realization that they have gone too far. He couldn't stay still any longer. He needed to move, to do something, just not to be alone with his thoughts. He slowly got out of bed, feeling heavy in his body, as if this night had left a mark on his every move. He went to the window, opened it, and breathed in the fresh morning air. It was necessary, at least something real to cling to at this moment, when everything else seemed illusory. Diana was in the next room. She had not slept for several hours, although her body remained motionless. Her mind was as chaotic as Kevin's. She was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and could not fully comprehend what had happened. Every nerve in her body screamed at her that what they had done was wrong. But at the same time, deep down, she knew that she would never regret this moment. She knew it was inevitable. Everything in their relationship was coming to this, no matter how much they both tried to deny it. She closed her eyes, trying to find the strength to accept the reality in which they now found themselves. Thoughts were spinning in her head that they would not be able to continue living the way they used to. Their relationship has changed forever, and now they have to make a choice. But what to do? How do I get everything back? How can we make sure that all this does not ruin their lives? These questions were pressing on her every second, and there was no answer to them. Diana got out of bed and slowly headed to the bathroom. The water running down her face was cold, but it didn't help her recover. She was looking in the mirror, but she couldn't recognize her reflection. It seemed that a completely different woman was standing in front of her, not the one she was yesterday. she was aware that what had happened was caused by more than just attraction. It was something that stretched much deeper, that lay on the border of fear, desire and suppressed emotions that had accumulated over the years. But now that everything had come out, something had to be done about it. They both understood that this was not just a moment of weakness. It was something that changed them forever. But what's next? How to live with this knowledge? How do you look into each other's eyes, knowing what happened between them? They understood that now they had to make a decision. But each of them was afraid of this moment, because they knew that any decision would have its consequences. Kevin left the room and headed for the kitchen. He tried to behave as usual, pour himself coffee, make toast. But his movements were slow and hesitant, as if he was afraid that any action might destroy the fragile shell they were both trying to preserve. He stood at the window, holding a cup in his hands, and looked out at the street, but his thoughts were far from everything that was happening around him. Diana joined him a few minutes later. She looked calm, but her eyes betrayed all the storm that was going on inside her. They stood in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. This silence was unbearable because it said much more than any words. They both knew that a conversation was inevitable, but neither knew where to start. Kevin felt that something irreversible was hanging between them. It wasn't just a mistake that could be forgotten. It was a decision that changed their lives, and now they would either have to accept it and move on, or try to take it all back, even though they both knew it was impossible. For the next hour, they both tried to mind their own business, but the tension grew. Diana started to clean the kitchen, but her movements were abrupt and nervous. She felt like everything was boiling inside her, like her emotions were rushing out. She couldn't pretend that everything was okay anymore. Kevin tried to focus on the little things, but his mind was preoccupied with what had happened between them. He knew it wasn't just a physical attraction. It was more than he could explain, and that made it even scarier. It was lunchtime, and the atmosphere in the house became unbearable. They both knew that it couldn't go on like this. Something had to be decided, but both were afraid to take the first step, because they knew that this decision would change everything. They could no longer hide behind the familiar roles of aunt and nephew. Their relationship had changed forever, and that knowledge weighed heavily on them. Kevin was trying to sort himself out. He knew that their bond was stronger than just a family one. But what now? How could he go on living knowing that he had destroyed something sacred? These thoughts tormented him like poisonous thorns, and he did not know how to deal with them. Diana suffered too. She knew she couldn't ignore what had happened. But what to do? She knew she had to make a decision that would change their lives. She dreaded this moment because she knew that any decision would be devastating. But it was impossible to retreat. Eventually, the day came to an end and the tension reached its peak. They both knew that conversation was inevitable. It was necessary to understand what they would do next. But each of them was afraid of this moment. They understood that this conversation would change everything, and there would be no turning back. Kevin felt a fire burning inside him that he could no longer contain. He knew that their relationship had changed, and trying to ignore it would be a mistake. But how to live on? How to deal with this feeling of guilt and desire at the same time? These questions haunted him. Diana understood that they could no longer hide from reality. Everything had changed, and now they had to accept it. But what's next? She couldn't find the answer to this question, and that scared her the most. The night fell again, and the house became quiet. But this silence was different. She was no longer calm. It was the silence before the storm, before they had to make a decision that would change their lives forever.